Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are absolutely thrilled to unpack one of the most provocative works of Victorian literature ever written. We're looking at Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure. Published in 1895, this book wasn't just a bestseller. It was an absolute bombshell. It was this unflinching, devastating critique of Victorian society that violently pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable to even whisper about in polite company. It challenged class barriers, marriage, education, religion, and sexuality so aggressively that it actually destroyed its creator's desire to ever write long-form fiction again.
Jude the Obscene. Get a load of that. That was the shocking nickname one prominent reviewer actually slapped onto the book almost immediately after it came out. But it perfectly captures the sheer pearl-clutching horror that Victorian critics felt when they read Hardy's radical questioning of their social norms. To them, this wasn't just a sad story, right? It was a dangerous, immoral, and relentlessly pessimistic attack on the very fabric of their society.
And the visceral reaction to this book had monumental consequences for literary history. Thomas Hardy, who was literally one of the greatest living writers of his era, was so utterly disillusioned by the fierce backlash that he completely turned his back on the form. He turned to poetry for the rest of his career and never wrote another novel. Think about that for a second. A single book caused one of the English language's greatest novelists to essentially drop the mic and walk away from fiction forever.
Okay, let's dive into this and look at exactly how furious Victorian society was. The 1895 outrage was intense, and it was immediate. Serialized in Harper's New Monthly magazine, the sexual frankness and critique of marriage were so scandalous that readers literally canceled their subscriptions in protest. Critics didn't just dislike it, they labeled it deeply immoral, and it went all the way to the top of the moral hierarchy. Bishops were reportedly out there burning copies of the book. I mean, imagine a novel today causing religious leaders to literally light it on fire. That is the level of fury Hardy managed to ignite.
Section 1. The Working Class Dreamer. Meet Jude Fawley. So to really understand the societal uproar, we have to look at the protagonist who challenged everything the Victorians held dear. Jude is a bright, deeply idealistic, but devastatingly poor working-class man from rural Wessex, which, if you know Hardy, is his famous fictionalized region of southwest England. From a very young age, Jude is driven by this intense intellectual ambition and a profound belief in self-improvement. He is a stonemason by day, working hard with his hands, but by night, he painstakingly teaches himself Latin and Greek. And this brilliantly illustrates the core conflict of Jude's life. On one side, you have his harsh reality. It's a life of inescapable poverty and grueling manual labor as a rural stonemason. But on the other side is his ultimate dream, gaining admission to study at the ancient, elite University of Christminster, which Hardy modeled directly on Oxford. So Jude is caught right in the middle, between the gritty, unyielding dirt of his daily life and the polished, totally inaccessible worlds of the university elite.
Section 2. The Love Triangle, Smashing Victorian Social Norms.
Now, Jude's academic struggles, that's really only half the story. The aspect of the novel that truly horrified readers was his entanglement with two vastly different women. Look at this stark contrast here. First, we have Arabella Dawn. She is sensual, pragmatic, and highly survival-oriented. She represents a very instinctual approach to life. Jude's impulsive marriage to her quickly traps him in a loveless union that actively clashes with his academic aspirations. But after that marriage deteriorates, he encounters his cousin, Sue Bridehead. Sue is the polar opposite of Arabella. She is intellectual, free-spirited, emotionally complex, and fiercely independent. She challenges every single Victorian ideal of femininity, and she quickly becomes the great, unconventional love of Jude's life.
So this love triangle quickly builds into a web of shattered dreams. Sue actually ends up marrying Richard Philliton, Jude's former teacher. A decent guy, sure, but one who is completely bound by social convention. So you have Jude trapped by his earthy, manipulative first wife Arabella, and Sue trapped by the conventional Philliton, even though Jude and Sue are deeply in love with each other. Through these four characters, Hardy weaves this painfully complicated narrative of societal pressure, where legal ties force people into absolute misery, and true love is treated like a scandal. Now, what's really interesting here is how cleanly this lays out Hardy's attack on society. Through these characters, he launches a systematic critique on three main pillars. First, he targets education and class barriers. Jude's repeated failures to get into Christminster expose how these so-called progressive institutions were rigidly closed off to the working class. Second, marriage and sexuality. Hardy launches a fierce attack on marriage under Victorian law, exposing the sheer misery of legally binding mismatched unions where getting a divorce was nearly impossible. And finally, religion and morality. Heavily influenced by Darwinism, Hardy was highly skeptical of organized religion, portraying faith as either hypocritical or just totally inadequate when faced with real human suffering. And that critique of religion is anchored by one of the novel's most famous lines, a biblical allusion from 2 Corinthians, "The letter killeth." Hardy brilliantly uses this scriptural reference to ironically critique society's rigid adherence to religious doctrine and legal rules over actual lived compassion. The letter of the law, whether it's university admissions, marriage certificates, or religious dogma, literally kills the spirit and the potential of these characters. Section 3. The crushing hand of fate. Life in a grip. In Hardy's world, it's not just society working against Jude and Sue. The universe itself is hostile. To truly grasp this, we have to understand determinism. This is the worldview that characters are trapped by forces entirely beyond their control. Things like the poverty they are born into, their own biology and instincts, rigid social conventions, and sheer blind chance. Hardy presents this deterministic universe that is often cruel and entirely indifferent to individual ambition or personal desire. Jude isn't just fighting the university, he's literally fighting fate. And nowhere is this cruelty more evident than in the character known as Little Father Time. This is Jude and Sue's incredibly sensitive son. Now, I won't spoil the exact events, but his actions and his ultimate fate deliver the novel's most profound, heartbreaking moments. Through this tragic child, Hardy underscores the theme of inherited suffering, the idea that the pain and displacement of the parents are just passed down to crush the next generation before it even has a chance to begin. It all culminates in this agonizing realization from the novel. Life seemed, in some sort, to have us in a grip and would not let us go. Just take a second to let the absolute bleakness of that sink in. Institutions and circumstances may entirely crush an individual, and Thomas Hardy simply refuses to look away from that suffering. Section 4. A modern masterpiece. Why read it today? So how exactly did a scandal that caused literal book burnings become a modern masterpiece? The evolution is super fascinating. Initially, yes, there was widespread Victorian outrage, but as time passed, society actually began to catch up to Hardy. By focusing so deeply on ordinary working people and their tangible psychological struggles, the book paved the way for 20th century social realism. And ultimately, it was recognized as a pioneering work of literary modernism. It combines these rich regional descriptions of Wessex with a tragic structure that heavily echoes classical Greek drama and Shakespeare. It completely transcended its scandal to become a work of structural genius. So the crucial point is why this matters today. Because Hardy's critiques, they are our modern cultural conversations. Inequality in education and social mobility, we are still fiercely debating who gets access to elite institutions. Evolving definitions of family, Sue's incredibly modern views on free unions versus legal marriage sound like they literally could have been written yesterday. Mental health pressures, toxic relationships, and the struggle of individual agency versus massive systemic forces, these are absolutely relevant today. Hardy diagnosed them way back in 1895. Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought. Have we truly dismantled the barriers that crushed Jude Fawley, or have we just renamed them? Thomas Hardy may have stopped writing novels because of the sheer fury this book caused, but with Jude the Obscure, he delivered a haunting, masterful closing statement that continues to challenge us well over a century later. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the systems around you.